Venom: The Last Dance is framed like a full stop, like Sony closing the book on Eddie Brock and moving on. Eddie's arc is cleanly wrapped, the emotional beats are resolved, and on the surface it really does feel like a goodbye. But if you've watched enough franchise movies, especially comic book ones, you know that endings like this are rarely real endings. They're pauses, breathers, strategic exits that leave just enough space to come back later. And The Last Dance absolutely does that, even when it pretends it doesn't. The biggest giveaway is how casually the movie lets the symbiote survive. Not in some epic cliffhanger, not in a massive tease, but in the most ridiculous and very Venom way possible. The alien ends up inside a cockroach. That's not a joke detail you throw in by accident. That's the filmmakers saying the symbiote still exists, it's still adaptive, and it's still out there. Small, overlooked, waiting. That alone already undercuts the idea of a true finale. Then you stack that on top of the MCU thread that's still very much alive. When Eddie crossed into the Marvel Cinematic Universe during No Way Home, a fragment of the symbiote was left behind. That moment wasn't fan service, it was a deliberate piece of long-term planning. Marvel doesn't plant seeds like that unless they intend to water them later. Whether it shows up directly in Spider-Man Brand New Day or gets saved for something bigger down the line, that symbiote fragment is still sitting in the MCU sandbox, untouched and full of potential. What makes this even more interesting is that the Venom crossover idea wasn't some last-minute studio scramble. Amy Pascal and Kevin Feige have been openly talking for years about expanding Spider-Man's world beyond a single continuity. The goal was never just MCU Spider-Man or Sony's standalone villain films. The goal was a wider shared ecosystem where characters could bounce between tones, universes, and formats. The problem is that Sony's side of that experiment mostly collapsed under its own weight. Venom was supposed to be the launchpad. Morbius, Madame Web, Kraven the Hunter were meant to follow and build out this separate Spider-Man universe without Spider-Man at the center. On paper, it sounded workable. In practice, it didn't connect. Those movies underperformed, got torn apart critically, and never found a real audience. Sony eventually admitted what everyone already knew. That universe, as a concept, was done. Venom survived that collapse because it was the exception. Not because it was perfect, but because it knew what it was. The trilogy stuck to a consistent tone, leaned into the odd couple dynamic between Eddie and the symbiote, and didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. Fans wanted darker, more brutal, more comic-accurate Venom. But even as loud popcorn blockbusters, the movies delivered entertainment and solid box office returns. That matters. Studios forgive a lot when a franchise keeps making money. And Sony is not a studio that walks away from valuable IP. Spider-Man is still one of the most powerful entertainment properties on the planet, and Sony owns the keys. Despite constant online rumors about Marvel buying back the rights, that idea doesn't hold up in reality. These rights aren't just about movies, they cover games, animation, merchandising, basically an entire multimedia empire. Sony isn't giving that up voluntarily, especially now. Spider-Man is hotter than ever. The animated Spider-Verse films turned Miles Morales into a global phenomenon. Into the Spider-Verse and Across the Spider-Verse weren't just hits, they were cultural moments. Beyond the Spider-Verse is still one of the most anticipated comic book movies on the horizon. At the same time, Sony continues to profit heavily from the MCU films starring Tom Holland. No matter how those deals are structured, Sony is sitting on a goldmine. And within Spider-Man's massive rogues gallery, Venom stands near the top. Green Goblin and Doc Ock are iconic, but Venom occupies a unique space. He's villain, anti-hero, monster, and franchise lead all at once. Thanks to comics, games, and Tom Hardy's portrayal, Venom has become a character who can stand on his own. Sony knows this. That's why The Last Dance feels less like an ending and more like a clearing of the board. The most realistic next step is not a straight Venom 4. It's some form of reinvention, a soft reboot that doesn't aggressively erase the past, but also doesn't chain itself to it. Something similar to what Bumblebee did for Transformers. Same universe in theory, familiar DNA, but a different tone and creative direction. Venom is perfectly suited for that kind of pivot. There's been talk for years about leaning harder into horror, and honestly, that's where Venom thrives. Body horror, practical effects, smaller budgets, stronger visual identity. A Venom movie that treats the symbiote as something unsettling instead of comedic could be incredible. That approach worked for Joker. It worked for Logan. Both films came out when audiences were supposedly tired of superhero movies, and both proved that strong, character-driven reinventions still hit hard. Joker sounded like a terrible idea on paper. A Batman villain movie movie without Batman, inspired by Taxi Driver, set decades before modern DC continuity. It ended up redefining what a comic book movie could be and crossed $1 billion. Logan did the same for Wolverine, turning what could have been another tired sequel into a brutal, emotional farewell that elevated the entire genre. Those movies proved that darker takes aren't a risk if they're done with purpose. Sony seems to have finally absorbed those lessons. They know the villain universe failed because Spider-Man was missing. They know tone matters, and they know Venom doesn't need to stay locked into Eddie Brock forever, which brings everything back to what The Last Dance quietly set up. During the final battle at Area 51, one of Strickland's soldiers is severely injured, losing both of his legs. He's referred to as Thompson. That name is not subtle. In the comics, Flash Thompson becomes Agent Venom after bonding with a symbiote through a government program. It's one of the cleanest, most logical evolutions the franchise could take. A soldier who's lost everything offered a chance to walk again through a risky experiment. Instead of a full-strength symbiote, he bonds with a weakened fragment left behind after the chaos of Eddie's final battle. The bond isn't karma because the host dominates the alien, but because the alien itself is exhausted. That immediately creates a different dynamic. Agent Venom opens the door to a totally different genre. Tactical combat, close quarters brutality, flashbacks to combat zones, government oversight, moral compromises, think less sci-fi buddy comedy and more grounded action with horror elements bleeding through. Stylistically, it could borrow from films like John Wick while still keeping the symbiote's feral edge. And the best part is that it doesn't require Tom Hardy or a hard reset. The casting is easy too. Thompson's face is never clearly shown in The Last Dance. He's always hidden behind gear. That gives Sony complete freedom to attach a new actor without awkward retcons. It's the cleanest possible handoff. Agony also feels like a piece of this puzzle. Her screen version was heavily reworked, ditching the comic-accurate acid powers in favor of super speed. She survives the finale, she stands out, and Juno Temple has already hinted that there are future plans. Studios don't reimagine a character like that unless they intend to use her again. She could be a rival, an uneasy ally, or even a new lead if Sony really wants to shake things up. Then there's the cosmic thread. Null finally speaks in the post-credits scene, talking about fallen champions and worlds yet to come. The dialogue is intentionally vague. The multiverse gives Sony even more flexibility. Venom established that symbiotes share a kind of multiversal hive mind. Memories, awareness, experiences bleeding across realities. That means Eddie Brock could theoretically return without undoing his ending. A different version, a different timeline, a one-off event, a crossover. Marvel already plays by those rules, and Sony has shown they're more than willing to use them when convenient. What feels unlikely is a traditional Venom 4 with Hardy front and center. His contract is done, and he's been clear that The Last Dance was his exit. A cameo somewhere down the line isn't impossible, but a full sequel seems like a stretch. Sony doesn't need him anymore to keep the symbiote alive. There's also talk of animation as a potential route. An animated Venom project would lower costs, open up visual freedom, and avoid live-action casting limitations. Given Sony's success with Spider-Verse, that idea shouldn't be dismissed. At the end of the day, The Last Dance made money. Not record-breaking money, but enough to keep the brand viable. That puts Sony in a familiar position. They know Venom works, but they also know the formula can't stay the same forever. The movie didn't close doors, it quietly unlocked new ones. Whether Sony goes with Agent Venom, a darker horror reboot, a cosmic reinvention, or something we haven't even heard about yet, one thing is clear. That cockroach wasn't a joke, Null wasn't a throwaway tease, and Venom is far too valuable to disappear.